The new cellmate. The first thing I learned about Blackmore Penitentiary was that the cold there did not come from the weather. It lived in the walls. It breathed through the cracks in the stone. It slipped beneath your clothes and rested against your bones like an old hand. I arrived there on a gray Tuesday morning with chains around my wrists and a number where my name used to be. My name is Adrian Vale. I was 24 years old when I was sent to Blackmore, though I felt much older by the time the iron gates closed behind me. Before prison, I had been an ordinary man with ordinary failures. I worked nights at a warehouse near the docks, drank too much when I was lonely, and carried a quiet anger I never knew how to put down. Then one winter evening outside a pub, I got into a fight with a man I barely knew. He shoved me. I shoved him back. He fell. His head struck the curb. And just like that, one careless moment became the rest of my life. People called me a murderer after that. The judge called it manslaughter. My mother called it a tragedy, but I called it the moment God looked away. Blackmore stood far from any town, hidden beyond wet fields and black pine forests. The building looked less like a prison and more like an ancient monastery built by men who believed suffering was holy. Tall stone towers rose into the mist. Narrow windows stared down like blind eyes. Gargoyles crouched along the roofline, their faces worn smooth by rain. The other prisoners went silent when they saw it. Even the guards seemed quieter there. A transport officer noticed me staring. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said. I looked at the dark walls. "No." He smiled without humor. "Good. Then you understand it." Inside, Blackmore smelled of old water, iron, and despair. Every sound echoed too long. Keys, boots, doors. Coughs from unseen men behind stone corridors. They processed me in a room with peeling paint and a single yellow bulb. They took my clothes, gave me a gray uniform, shaved my head, checked my teeth, my scars, my hands. By the time they were done, I felt less like a man than something catalogued. A guard named Havel escorted me through the main wing. He was tall and thin, with a face like carved wood, and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "You keep quiet," he said. "You follow routine. You don't borrow. You don't owe. You don't ask questions after lights out." I nodded. "What happens after lights out?" Havel glanced at me. His expression did not change, but something in his silence answered before he did. "Nothing you want to know." We descended a narrow corridor, where the stone walls sweated moisture despite the cold. The deeper we walked, the fewer voices I heard. Finally, we stopped before a black iron door marked 27. The number had been scratched repeatedly into the metal, as if many hands had tried to carve it away. Havel unlocked the door. "Your cell." I stepped inside. It was smaller than I expected. 2 bunks. 1 metal sink. 1 toilet. 1 thin window too high to see through. The walls were stained dark in places, and near the floor, the stone looked damaged by long scratches. A man sat on the lower bunk opposite mine. Thin. Pale. Almost colorless. He looked perhaps 30, but illness or fear had hollowed him until age became impossible to guess. His hair hung over his forehead in damp strands, and his eyes stayed fixed on the floor. "This is Ellis Havel," said. The man did not look up. Havel shoved my bedding into my arms. "Try not to bother each other." Then he left. The door slammed shut behind him with a sound so final it seemed to remove the world outside. For several seconds I stood there holding the bedding. Ellis remained motionless. "Adrian," I said quietly. No response. I placed my things on the top bunk and sat down. The mattress was thin and cold. Only then did Ellis speak. "Don't sleep on your back." I looked at him. His voice was dry, fragile, almost unused. "What?" He still stared at the floor. "Don't sleep on your back. It watches faces." A chill moved through me. I almost left, but something about him stopped me. "What watches faces?" Ellis slowly lifted his eyes. They were pale blue and deeply tired. "Room 27. I stared at him, waiting for a smile. None came. That first evening passed in the strange rhythm of prison life. Dinner came through the hatch. The food was gray, lukewarm, tasteless. Men shouted in distant corridors. Somebody sobbed for nearly an hour, 2 cells down. Ellis barely moved. He ate 3 spoonfuls, then pushed the tray away and began counting quietly under his breath. At first, I thought he was praying. Then I realized he was counting seconds. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Waiting." for what he looked toward the ceiling, for the lights. At exactly 9 o'clock, the corridor bell rang. The lights dimmed. Ellis immediately climbed into his bunk and turned toward the wall. "Do not answer anything tonight," he whispered. I sat upright. What does that mean? He pulled the blanket to his chin. "If something says your name, don't answer." Then the cell went silent. I told myself he was disturbed. Of course he was. Prison breaks men in different ways. Some become violent, some become quiet. Some invent rules to survive the dark. I lay down on the upper bunk and stared at the ceiling. For a while, nothing happened. Only the normal sounds of prison. Distant coughing, a guard's footsteps, water dripping somewhere behind the wall. Then sometime deep into the night, I heard scratching. Soft at first. So soft I thought it was a rat. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. It came from beneath my bunk. I held my breath. The sound continued slowly, patiently, like fingernails dragging along stone. "Ellis," I whispered. The lower bunk across the room creaked slightly. "Don't," he breathed. The scratching stopped. Then something whispered my name. Adrian. Not loudly, not clearly, but close. Too close. My heart slammed against my ribs. I stared down toward the darkness beneath my bunk, but from where I lay I could see nothing. Adrian. This time it sounded like my mother. Not exactly her voice, but close enough to hurt. My throat tightened. I had not seen her since the sentencing. Her face in court still lived inside me. Pale, shaking, destroyed by love and shame. "Adrian," the voice whispered again. Ellis began crying softly from the other bunk. "Don't answer," he whispered. "Please don't answer." I pressed my hands over my ears and shut my eyes. The whispering continued for several minutes. Then it stopped, all at once, like something had lost interest. I did not sleep after that. Morning came slowly. When the lights brightened, Ellis looked worse than before. His skin had a gray cast, and dark circles hollowed his eyes. I climbed down from my bunk and immediately looked underneath. Nothing. Only dust, scratches, and a long black stain beneath the bed that looked disturbingly like dried blood. At breakfast, I tried asking another prisoner about cell 27. He was an older man with white hair and tattooed hands. The moment I said the number, he stopped eating. "Who put you there, Havel?" The old prisoner shook his head. "Then you offended someone already. What's wrong with it?" He leaned closer. His breath smelled of tobacco and rot. "Room 27 never stays empty." Before I could ask more, a guard shouted for silence. The old man looked away and never spoke to me again. That afternoon, I noticed Ellis knew things before they happened. He stood before the guard arrived. He stepped away from the door seconds before keys rattled in the corridor. At one point, he whispered, "Don't look." Moments before, two prisoners attacked each other near the yard fence. That night, I asked him how long he had been in cell 27. Ellis stared at the floor. Too long. How long he looked toward the wall beside my bunk. I don't remember anymore. Then he whispered, "But it remembers me." At 3:13 in the morning, I woke suddenly. The cell was dark. The air was freezing. Ellis was standing in the corner facing my bed. Tears ran silently down his face. His eyes were not on me. They were fixed beneath my bunk. "What is it?" I whispered. Ellis raised one trembling finger to his lips. Then in a voice barely alive, he said, "It knows you're awake." Slowly, against every instinct in my body, I looked over the edge of the bunk. In the darkness beneath my bed, something was breathing. The things inside the walls. I did not scream when I heard the breathing beneath my bed. Fear had already moved beyond screaming by then. It had become something colder, something deeper. The sound rose slowly from the darkness under the bunk like the breath of a sleeping animal. Wet, uneven, human. Every muscle in my body locked instantly. Across the cell, Ellis remained frozen in the corner, tears sliding silently down his face. "Don't move," he whispered. The breathing continued. I stared downward into the darkness beneath my mattress, trying to force my eyes to adjust. But the shadows under the bed looked impossibly thick, as though the darkness itself had substance there. Then something shifted below me. A slow scraping sound, like skin dragging across concrete. My throat tightened violently. "Guard," I shouted instinctively. No answer came from the corridor. Only silence. The breathing stopped immediately. For one horrible second, the entire prison seemed completely still. Then the lights snapped on. Bright. Sudden. The sound beneath the bed vanished. I climbed down immediately, ignoring Ellis grabbing weakly at my sleeve. "Don't," he begged. But I dropped to my knees anyway and looked underneath the bunk. Nothing. Only cracked concrete. Dust. And those same deep scratches carved into the floor beneath the bed frame. I stood slowly. "There's nothing there." Ellis stared at me with exhausted eyes. "That's what it wants." The next several days hollowed me out piece by piece. Sleep became impossible. Every night, room 27 changed. Some nights I heard whispering inside the walls, not random sounds. Voices. Men crying softly. Someone praying in another language. At least once, I heard a woman screaming somewhere deep beneath the floor. The guards never reacted. Neither did the other prisoners. It was as though Blackmore had trained everyone to ignore suffering after dark. Ellis grew worse each day. He barely ate. He constantly checked the time. And he never ever looked beneath my bunk again. One afternoon during yard hour, I finally asked another inmate about him. The prisoner's name was Moreau, an older Frenchman with broken fingers and faded tattoos across his throat. The moment I mentioned Ellis, his expression changed. "You talked to him?" he asked quietly. "He's my cellmate." Moreau stared at me for several seconds. Then he slowly shook his head. "No," he whispered. "He isn't." A cold feeling spread through my chest. "What's that supposed to mean?" Moreau glanced toward the watchtower before speaking again. "Men in room 27 see things. I'm not seeing things. Everyone says that." Before I could question him further, the guards ordered us back inside. That evening, I noticed something new. The mirror above the sink. It was not real glass, only scratched prison steel polished enough to reflect shapes. While washing my hands, I glanced upward and froze. For half a second, somebody stood behind me in the reflection, tall, thin, watching. I turned instantly. The cell was empty except for Ellis sitting silently on his bunk. My pulse hammered painfully. "You saw something again," Ellis said softly. I looked toward him. "How do you know?" "Because it starts small." I stepped closer. "What starts?" He raised his eyes slowly. "The room learning you." That night I dreamed of Blackmore for the first time. Or maybe it was not a dream. Even now, I cannot fully decide. I woke standing barefoot, in a corridor I had never seen before. The prison stretched endlessly around me beneath flickering yellow lights. Water dripped from the ceiling. Rusted chains swayed softly somewhere in the darkness ahead. Every cell door stood open, and from inside each cell, someone was breathing. I walked slowly through the corridor while whispers followed me through the walls. "Stay. Don't leave. Please." Then I heard Ellis crying somewhere nearby. I followed the sound until I reached cell 27. The door stood slightly open. Inside, Ellis sat on the floor staring toward the lower bunk. "Adrian," he whispered without looking at me. "What happened?" His voice trembled violently. "It wants another one." Then something grabbed my ankle from beneath the bed. I woke instantly screaming. The entire cell was dark, except for moonlight through the tiny window. Ellis sat upright on his bunk, staring directly at me. "You touched it," he whispered. The next morning, I demanded to speak with Warden Greaves. Greaves was an enormous man, with silver hair and dead eyes, who smelled faintly of cigarettes and old paper. His office overlooked the prison yard through dirty windows, stained by rain. He listened silently while I explained everything. The voices, the breathing, Ellis, the nightmares. When I finished, he leaned back slowly in his chair. "You want to transfer?" "Yes." Greaves studied me for a long moment. Then he asked quietly, "How long have you been speaking to Ellis?" I frowned. "What?" "How long since I arrived?" Something unreadable crossed the warden's face. He opened a drawer slowly and removed a thin folder. Then he slid it across the desk toward me. Inside was a death report. Ellis Harrow, deceased 3 months prior. My hands went numb instantly. No. The warden's expression remained empty. Ellis Harrow hanged himself in cell 27 during winter. That's impossible. He was buried in March. I stared at the photograph clipped inside the file. Ellis. Same pale face. Same tired eyes. My mouth went dry. You're lying. Warden Greaves leaned forward slightly. Mr. Vale, he said softly, you have been alone in cell 27 since the day you arrived. I left the office shaking. The corridor outside seemed unreal beneath the fluorescent lights. Every sound felt distant. Every face looked unfamiliar. I kept replaying the warden's words inside my head. You've been alone. No, that was impossible. I had spoken to Ellis, shared meals with him. He had warned me, cried in front of me. How could no one else see him? That night, I returned to cell 27, terrified of what I would find. The door opened slowly. The cell was empty. Only one bunk looked used, mine. The lower bunk across from me was neatly made untouched, almost ceremonial. I backed toward the corridor immediately. Then I heard Ellis's voice behind me. You shouldn't have asked questions. I turned. Ellis sat calmly on the lower bunk, except now his neck bent slightly sideways. Too far sideways. A dark purple bruise circled his throat. I stumbled backward in horror. Ellis smiled weakly. The expression looked heartbreakingly sad. I tried to warn you, he whispered. The lights flickered overhead, and beneath my bed, something began scratching again. The man who stayed. For several seconds I could not move. Ellis sat on the lower bunk with his broken neck tilted toward one shoulder, smiling at me in the trembling yellow light. The bruise around his throat looked almost black. His eyes, once pale with fear, now held something deeper than exhaustion. Resignation. I tried to warn you, he whispered again. The scratching beneath my bed stopped. Then something under the bunk sighed. Not breathed. Sighed. Like a disappointed man. I backed against the cell door and began pounding on it with both fists. Guard. My voice cracked against the stone walls. Open the door. Ellis did not move. His smile faded slowly. They won't come yet. What are you? I shouted. His eyes lowered. The same thing you'll be. Those words destroyed whatever courage I had left. I screamed for Havel, for the warden, for anyone. I kicked the iron door until pain shot through my foot. I shouted until my throat felt torn. No one came. Outside the cell, the corridor remained perfectly silent. Too silent. Prison was never silent. Men coughed. Pipes groaned. Guards walked. Someone always muttered in sleep or cursed from a nearby cell. But now Blackmore had gone quiet in a way that made it feel abandoned by the living. Ellis looked toward the wall behind my bunk. It chose you the first night. No. It calls what is already broken. I shook my head violently. I'm not staying here. A sadness crossed his face. I said that too. Then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the cell whole. I pressed myself against the door, breathing hard. Somewhere near the floor, the scratching began again. Slow. Patient. Closer than before. I felt the air change. The walls seemed to breathe inward, making the cell smaller by invisible degrees. Then the whispering started. Not one voice now. Dozens. Men. Women. Old voices. Young voices. All speaking from inside the stone. Adrian. Stay. Forgive us. Take his place. I covered my ears, but the voices were not entering through sound. They were inside my skull. The darkness beneath my bed shifted. Something crawled out. I did not see it clearly. Only pieces. A hand too thin. A shoulder folded at the wrong angle. Hair dragging across the floor. And behind it, the smell of wet earth and old blood. Ellis began crying again. I'm sorry, he whispered. The thing moved toward me. Then suddenly the corridor bell rang. The lights returned. The cell was empty. Ellis was gone. The thing was gone. Only I remained curled on the floor beside the door, shaking so badly I could not stand. By morning, Havel opened cell 27 and found me like that. He looked down at me without surprise. You saw him, he said. I lifted my head slowly. Ellis. Havel's jaw tightened. He glanced over his shoulder, then stepped inside and shut the door halfway. You need to listen carefully, he said quietly. Do not speak his name where the walls can hear you. The exhaustion inside me turned into rage. You knew. Havel said nothing. You all knew. His face hardened, but his eyes looked tired. Everyone knows something about this room. Then move me. I can't. You mean you won't? He looked toward the scratched floor beneath my bunk. I mean, I can't. That afternoon, I was dragged before Warden Greaves again. This time, I did not beg. I demanded. I threatened. I told him I would tear the cell apart, refuse orders, scream, every night until the entire prison heard me. Greaves listened, without emotion. When I finished, he opened a cabinet behind his desk and removed an old leather-bound ledger. The pages were yellowed, brittle, stained by age. He turned it toward me. At the top of one page was written, Cell 27, Special Holding Room. The records began in 1894. Names filled the pages. Dozens, then hundreds. Political prisoners, runaways, men accused of treason, women who had never received trials, people who disappeared inside Blackmore before modern laws learned how to pretend mercy existed. Many entries ended with the same phrase, remained in room. I stared at the words. What does that mean? Greaves closed the ledger slowly. It means the room was never built to hold bodies. His voice was quiet now, almost reverent. It was built to hold guilt. I felt sick. He continued. Blackmore is old, Mr. Vale. Older than the records. Older than any of us understand. Some places become hungry when enough suffering happens inside them. You're insane. Perhaps. He leaned forward. But you know I'm telling the truth. The worst part was that I did. Deep down, I already knew. What does it want from me? Greaves looked at me for a long time. Someone must remain. The words landed with quiet finality. Ellis remained before you, he said. Now the room is finished with him. No. The process has already started. I lunged across the desk. 2 guards seized me before my hands reached his throat. As they dragged me back through the corridors, I screamed until my voice broke. But nobody looked surprised. Nobody even looked afraid. That night, Cell 27 changed. The walls were wet when I entered. Not damp. Wet. Dark liquid ran in thin streams down the stone and gathered near the floor like blood diluted by rain. The scratches beneath my bunk had spread across the walls. Names. Hundreds of names carved into the stone. And at eye level, freshly cut into the wall above the sink, was mine. Adrian Vale. I stumbled backward. No. The lower bunk creaked. Ellis sat there again. Less solid now. Fainter. Almost transparent at the edges. He looked relieved in a way that horrified me. It's letting me go, he whispered. Don't leave me here. His eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. You can help me. I tried. No, you warned me. That isn't helping. He flinched as though I had struck him. Then he looked at the cell door. At 313 it opens. My breath caught. What? The door. It opens once. Then I can run. His face twisted with grief. You can try. At 313 the lock clicked. The door of cell 27 opened by itself. I did not hesitate. I ran. The corridor outside stretched ahead beneath flickering lights. But it was not the corridor I knew. It was longer. Much longer. Every cell door stood open. Inside each cell, men stood facing the walls, whispering prayers into stone. I ran past them. My bare feet slapped against freezing concrete. The hallway turned left, then right, then downstairs. That should not have existed. I passed Havel standing motionless at the end of one corridor. I shouted his name. He did not move. When I reached him, I saw his eyes were sewn shut with black thread. I screamed and ran harder. Every passage led deeper. Every stairway descended. Every door opened into another hallway. And then, without understanding how I found myself standing once more before cell 27, the door waited open. Inside, Ellis stood near the back wall, nearly gone. I'm sorry, he said. Behind me, the entire prison began whispering my name. I tried running again. Again, the corridors twisted. Again, the prison returned me to that door. By the 4th time, my legs gave out. By the 5th, I was crying. By the 6th, I crawled. And when I reached cell 27 again, something inside the room reached out from beneath the bunk and took my hand. The touch was cold. Almost gentle. Morning came. At least I think it did. Havel opened the cell door with 3 other guards behind him. I was no longer inside. Not in the way they understood. My body was gone. On the wall, written in dark, wet letters, was a new sentence. He finally stayed. They searched the prison for 3 days. Dogs, guards, tunnels, Drainage rooms, nothing. No body, no escape. No Adrian Vale. Months later, another young prisoner arrived at Blackmore. They brought him to cell 27 with a bundle of bedding in his arms. I watched from the corner where the light never reaches. He looked frightened, too young, too alive. Havel pushed him inside and avoided looking at me. The new prisoner stared around the cell. "Was someone here before me?" he asked. Havel's face tightened. After a long pause, he said, "Nobody stays here for long." Then he shut the door. The boy sat on the bunk and began to cry quietly. I wanted to tell him not to sleep on his back. I wanted to tell him not to answer if something called his name. I wanted to save him. But when I opened my mouth, only the room spoke, and softly from beneath his bed, something began to breathe.